can shut the doors now. Looks okay.
Okay. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I'm Meredith Skira, the Fall Director for Scientia, and I'm here to welcome you and to say, oh! Jim Pomerantz told me it was National Pirates Day, and he knows how to do these things. Seriously, this is the opening lecture for our series on constructing the human, and I welcome you to the distinguished beginning and hope you will enjoy it and all the other lectures that will follow it in the course of the year. I will introduce our speaker for today in just a moment, but first I want to say a word or two about Scientia for those of you who are new or who haven't been familiar with Scientia in the past, and give you a little idea about the context for this series. Scientia is the Institute for the History of Science and Culture, founded by Solomon Bachner in 1981. Solomon Bachner was himself a historian of science and a mathematician, and he established the group to foster scholarly discussion across disciplinary boundaries, and that's just what it has done in all the years I've known it. The members come from many, many different disciplines. Scientia sponsors annual series of colloquia like this one. It sponsors other programs of interest nationally or locally. It had a program last year on Katrina, which brought in members of the community and faculty together. The high point of the year is the Bachner Lecture, when a distinguished visitor comes to speak on the general topic for the year. We will be getting in touch with you soon about that. And Scientia now sponsors the DeLange Conference. Our conference that's coming up in the spring is dedicated to studying emerging libraries, and it will discuss the transformation in the discovery, distribution, and organization of knowledge. It has an extraordinary list of distinguished speakers from all over, and it promises to be one of the best things that we have seen coming from Rice, I think, I hope. Before I turn to this year's talk, I would like to thank all the people who have made this possible. Ellen Butler, our coordinator, who has done so much of the work. She does the important things, I just do the rest. And all of the IT people who make possible the filming of this so that you can see it in the form of a webcast. And I would like to welcome the people in the audience, those who have come from off campus, thank you, and the distinguished members of our administration. We're grateful for them for showing their interest, the deans who are here, and our president as well. This year's topic for the colloquia is constructing the human being. You have a description, or maybe have seen a description, but I'll read it to you. The question, what is man, Kant once observed, is the encompassing question for all philosophy. We know that individual human beings are constructed through development, and the human species is constructed through evolution. But every time we think we can decide what the human is, we find out how much we are inventing it in the process. We already make and remake our bodies through diet, fitness, surgery, and chemistry. By now, biotechnological interventions extend the remaking process further to prosthetics, tissue engineering, and genetic enhancement. Not only science, but language, education, and culture all conspire in fashioning and self-fashioning individual humans, a much debated process that challenges traditional categories like gender. The arts, too, serve to construct virtual humans in fictions and paintings. By considering the continuing construction and reconstruction of human beings, we can gain insight into our fundamental nature and into its ever-shifting process. Tonight's speaker, the first speaker on this topic, is Alexander Xavier Byrd, Assistant Professor of History, and he will speak for about 50 minutes, after which there will be time for questions from the audience, and finally, following that, a reception to which all of you are invited, and I hope you'll come and continue the discussion there. Alex's area of expertise is African American history, especially Black life in the 18th century in the whole Atlantic world, not just the US, and also Jim Crow South. He is presently completing a book on Black transatlantic migration, both the voluntary and the involuntary kind, and his period is the American Revolution. It's called Captives and Voyagers. Alex has published essays in the William and Mary Quarterly. He has essays in books such as Constructing Borders and Crossing Boundaries, Race, Ethnicity, and Migration, and books like Remembering Jim Crow, African American Life in the Segregated South. He has also published several essays on pedagogical issues related to his interests, and he has won many, many awards, such as the American Council of Learned Societies Award, the Shelby Cullum Davis Center for Historical Studies at Princeton Award, and a Woodrow Wilson National Fellowship Foundation Award. And here at Rice, he has won the prestigious, in a different way, award, the George R. Brown Award for Superior Teaching. He will speak to us on a topic entitled From Chattel to Human, Race, Politics, and the American Revolution's Black Refugees. Please join me in welcoming him.
I'm on. Am I on? All right. I too want to thank Ellen Butler for helping getting everything in order for this afternoon. And I want to thank the board of Scientia for the very kind invitation to speak to all of you today. And I really want to thank all of you for coming. And I guess I should hurry up and get started. At the risk of utterly confusing everything else I will say this afternoon, I want to begin with some words from Thomas Jefferson, from a book he wrote called Notes on the State of Virginia. The passages are excerpted from a section of the book in which Jefferson addresses the possibility of a general slave emancipation in Virginia and the impracticality, in the case of such an emancipation, of retaining the newly emancipated blacks within the borders of the state, and thus the absolute necessity, should they be emancipated, of colonizing them elsewhere. And in this section on the Notes of the State of Virginia, Jefferson is explaining what he sees as the political differences, but also, and this is a very imprecise term for Jefferson, the racial differences between blacks and whites that necessitates this separation. So here he is on some of the physical differences. Besides those of color, figure, and hair, there are other physical distinctions proving a difference of race. They have less hair on the face and body. They secrete less by the kidneys. He's speaking of blacks, of African Americans. They secrete less by the kidneys and more by the glands of the skin, which gives them a very strong and disagreeable odor. They seem to require less sleep. A black, after hard labor through the day, will be induced by the slightest amusements to sit up until midnight or later, though knowing he must be out with the first dawn of the morning. They are at least as brave and more adventuresome, but this may perhaps proceed from a want of forethought, which prevents them from seeing a danger until it be present. When present, they do not go through it with the coolness or the steadiness of the whites. They are more ardent after their female, but love seems with them to be more an eager desire than a tender, delicate mixture of sentiment and sensation. Their griefs are transient. Their griefs are transient. The numberless afflictions which render it doubtful whether heaven has given us life in mercy or in wrath are less felt by them and sooner forgotten with them. In general, their existence appears to participate more of sensation than reflection. To this must be ascribed their disposition to sleep when abstracted from their diversions and unemployed in labor. An animal whose body is at rest and who does not reflect must be disposed to sleep of course. And then toward the end of this passage, he advances what is a theory for him, and he's advancing very carefully, that there are some important fundamental differences between blacks and whites. I advance it, therefore, as a suspicion only. It's only a suspicion. That the blacks, whether originally a distinct race or made distinct by time and circumstances, are inferior to the whites in the endowments both of body and mind. It is not against experience to suppose that different species of the same genus or varieties of the same species may possess different qualifications. These passages from Jefferson speak to an 18th century debate concerning the nature and the quality of black humanity. And though it may not sound so to our ears, Jefferson is a fairly careful participant in this debate. If you doubt me, I could read to you the remarks of Edward Long, a Jamaican planter, when he weighs in on the humanity of blacks, and you will see Jefferson's sort of very steady, though that may be giving him too much credit, but very steady and careful. He's not convinced. He's waiting for evidence. Edward Long is convinced that blacks are a distinct people. What's important to keep in mind is that in the aftermath of the American War, as this country's founding generation struggled to give finer voice to the ideas and institutions that would animate the new nation, for many of the founding fathers, there was a question as to whether the blacks among them were as fully human as they were. And so it should come as no surprise concerning the historiography of the efforts and successes of the founders for a long time was characterized by a propensity of doubting what work that black Americans or African Americans did in the revolutionary moment. And looking back, there's been a long line of questions of whether blacks, at least for historians, were political beings at all. And this stems, I would argue, from this earlier discussion of whether they should be considered human. We've come a long way, I hope, since then. Maybe we haven't come as long as we think. Now, I say that, I wonder, but we've come a long way since then, at least in the historiography. And it is now generally acknowledged that blacks participated in and affected the course of the revolution in several key ways, in ways that would counter some of Jefferson's thinking about the humanity of African Americans. And this understanding, our understanding of black participation in the revolutionary moment has proceeded in waves. There was a first wave of scholarship that basically said blacks were patriots. They were patriots just like everyone else. They took up arms, they fought with the rebels. I'm speaking from the wrong perspective. They fought with the patriots against the British, and they should be recognized for that work. They should be able to join the Daughters of the American Revolution if they want. A second sort of finding in this first wave of historiography was giving African Americans, especially in the North, free African Americans in the North, credit for firing and catalyzing the beginnings of an abolitionist movement, or of the early abolitionist movement. Later scholarly realizations have stressed sort of different points. Once folks were certain that we could call African Americans patriots and that they pushed the abolitionist movement forward, we began to look more closely and actually reveal more of what some historians would call the truth of the matter. And that is that more African Americans chose to ally themselves with the British than did with the patriots, with the rebels, because the American Revolution from the African American perspective, the argument goes, was a fight for freedom. And whoever offered you that freedom, or wherever you thought you had the better chance of gaining that freedom, that's where you went. Gary Nash argues that the American Revolution was the largest slave revolt in the history of the United States, in continental American history. The latest estimates of how many African Americans flee their plantations or flee their bondage measure at around 20,000. A lot of them die in the process, and we'll talk some of that, but 20,000 is the estimate of how many folks make a run for freedom. The second wave of scholarship has also called attention on the building of black institutions, which happened in the revolutionary moment. Those of you who are Baptists, I am Baptist, know that the first independent black Baptist churches owe their existence to the circumstances of the revolution. If you happen to be an African-American Freemason, you know that institution, those institutions trace their origins to this period as well. The first independent black schools, or some of the earliest independent black schools, come from this moment. And indeed, we've been so successful in unearthing the African-American presence in the revolutionary period, we sometimes even go too far. Here's Benjamin Quarles, who wrote a very important history of blacks during the Revolution, concluding about what the larger significance of black participation in the war was. Quarles wrote as follows: "Ultimately, the colored people of America benefited from the irreversible commitment of the new nation to the principle of liberty and equality." He wrote that in the 1960s. By the 1980s, I think he had sort of thought a little better of it. We know that commitment was, of course, in no way irreversible. But some historians still stick to it, or still like to stick to. Gordon Wood has written as follows concerning the collateral effects of the extensions of white male liberty during the revolutionary period. Wood writes as follows: "Indeed, the principles of their achievements made possible the eventual strivings of others, blacks, slaves, and women, for their own freedom, independence, and prosperity." This is, I think, too neat of a tying up of what happens. It leaves too much history out. But we have a lot of folks to thank for that. And if I hurry up and get through with my talk, and you're interested in the topic beyond today, I recommend that you pick up a few of these books, one or a few of these books. Benjamin Quarles' The Negro in the American Revolution, Sylvia Fry's Water from the Rock, and over the last 2 years, there's been an avalanche of scholarship on the subject. Cassandra Pybus, Epic Journeys of Freedom, Gary Nash's The Forgotten Fifth, and Simon Schama, Rough Crossings. You know, if Simon Schama is writing about it, you need to pick it up. No? He writes about everything. But still, there are paths that require further exploration. And this is what I want to do, or the topic that I want to settle on today. And I'm going to start with Gary Nash's evaluation of the scholarship and how it's unfolded in order to make plain the area where I think we need to make a little more progress. Nash writes as follows: "Black survivors of the Revolution brought to the task of starting their world anew an accumulation of disabilities, years of unceasing and unpaid toil, brutal treatment, efforts to keep them illiterate, cruelties that tore at their family fabric, and the disdain of most white people. Thus, what they accomplished in the aftermath of the Revolution is all the more extraordinary. It's truly unexampled in the Atlantic world of their day. They could not write state constitutions or transform the political system under which white revolutionaries intended to live as an independent people. But the black founding fathers embarked on a project to accomplish what is almost always part of a modern revolutionary agenda: to recast the social system." And it's this second to the last point of Nash's that I want to take off from. Because there were indeed black survivors of the Revolution who did have the opportunity to participate in the kind of potential nation building that we associate most with doing a political history of the Revolution. I think what has kept scholars from focusing on the politics of these black revolutionaries is that they weren't patriots and they didn't stay in this country. They were the refugees of the American Revolution who departed with the British and then had an opportunity to build a society in Western Africa, in Sierra Leone. And I'm going to focus on one particular wave of these refugees. There are two waves of them. There's a first wave that leaves London in 1786, around 1786, 1787. And these are refugees from the American War who end up in London starving on the streets. When they're noticed by white philanthropists, it comes to the philanthropist's attention that they organize subscriptions in order to feed these blacks. And then the philanthropists decide to strike at the very heart of the problem of black poverty in London. And the solution they come up with is, let's get these people out of here. And they decide that we can send them off somewhere. And Sierra Leone, through much discussion and debate, is the place where they end up. There's a second phase of migration that happened 1791-92 that comes from Nova Scotia, and it's a much larger migration. I'm going to leave that one aside. I want to focus on the black poor. These folks from London are known as the black poor. I want to focus on them because they've been given very little, they haven't been given their due politically, I think. Cassandra Pybus in her new work calls them, basically, their society was anarchy. Neither civil nor clerical authority carried weight with these people. And this is a characterization of them that stems from contemporary times. Most of the whites who worked with them thought they were very difficult to get along with, and that you could never start a country with these people. But I think that folks like Pybus are right on one end, that these were a very difficult people. But there's another way to phrase that difficulty and to understand it, and that's what I want the rest of my remarks to focus on. I'm convinced, and I want to persuade you, that these people, there were about 400 of them, who left London in 1786-87 and who moved to Sierra Leone. And when they got there, basically most of them died or ran away. But a small cadre of them started the business of building a society. What I want to persuade you is that looking at those people provides some of the best available evidence concerning how African Americans, when given the chance, would make use of the political and social opportunities that were available during the Revolutionary Age. And I'm going to focus on one particular leg of their journey. That's the settlement in Sierra Leone, though I think I could make similar points with other legs of the journey, and if you want to talk about it later, that's fine. When the black poor left London for Sierra Leone, they had a very difficult voyage. But when they arrived on 3 transports, the Atlantic, the Vernon, and the Belisarius, and they were accompanied by a naval ship, the HMS Nautilus, who was captained by Captain Thomas Thompson. And the black poor entered the Sierra Leone River with the Nautilus's guns firing out commands. And it brought attention to them, and they started the negotiations for land. When the natives came up to meet them, they began treating for what these people's establishment were going to be. But even before they had made arrangements for land, the black poor left their ships. They walked up this hill. They hacked a path up this hill and began their settlement. And things looked like they were off to a really good start. But the very next day, the first day after their landing at Sierra Leone, it rained. And then the next day it rained. And then the day after that, it rained. And then the day after that it rained. And then 4 days straight after that it rained. And then came a brief respite, but then the following week it rained twice. And then the week after that, it rained only twice again. But then came June, and in the whole month of June it rained almost daily. And when the crew of the Nautilus was celebrating the birthday of King George on June 4th, it rained. And the day that they settled with the natives, the treaty for the land, it rained. And the entire month of September, it rained. Basically what had happened is these folks had arrived in West Africa during the wet season, the worst possible time. And so they started on a very bad foot. It made it very difficult for them to erect shelter. It made planting of crops a near impossibility. The material consequences of the rainy season aggravated morbidity and mortality that they had already experienced on the sea voyage over. And the consequence is that in the first 4 months of their settlement, it's likely that about 2/3 of the colonists either perished or deserted the colony altogether. But there was a small number of people, about 130 or so, who remained and who decided to build the province of freedom in Sierra Leone. And it's important to investigate the nature of that society. I think we've got to give Pybus her due when she explains, when she describes the Black Poor as being completely out of control and hard to manage. Their situation was completely out of control. They lived under circumstances that did not encourage the development of the good society or of a good society. The first thing to fall by the wayside because of material conditions at Sierra Leone was an ideal of a kind of interracial community or interracial fellowship. The folks who had organized the voyage had sent white skilled workers along and some white supervisors. In addition to that, some of the black migrants had white wives, though the philanthropists in London had nothing to do with that. But they didn't. But at the landing, I have no evidence they had anything to do with it. But at the landing, the first casualty of material conditions at Sierra Leone was the idea of interracial, an interracial community. When the white preacher on board ship tried to get some of the black refugees to build him a home, I don't know why he didn't build his own home. Everyone else was building their own home. They said no, and he ran off. And that happened with a lot of the white workers who wanted to exercise a certain amount of control, but once they landed in Sierra Leone and conditions were so bad that they found that it wasn't in their interest to remain with the settlers, and so they left and moved to make homes with the slave traders, the white slave traders from Liverpool and Bristol who occupied the area. But even black society itself was at risk in Sierra Leone. Black society in the early months was characterized by great animosity and fights and infighting and even murder. It looked like any time someone or one of the black leaders would gain some leverage or control in trying to organize a group, there would be some type of internal discord. And it makes sense because these were people who were starving to death, who were ill-clothed, and who were basically just trying to scratch out a living day to day. So all that, I think, is not a point for debate. Things were miserable, and society, you can make the argument that society was in many ways miserable. But still, there's something that is remarkable about Sierra Leone, even within this context. Still, what was remarkable about black settler society at Sierra Leone was not the nearly unceasing strife and desperation that characterized social relations and action at the settlement. What was most remarkable was that both in reaction to and in spite of conditions that prevailed at the colony, the surviving settlers constantly strived for, and at moments achieved, a society marked by extraordinary levels of democracy and cooperative action. What was remarkable was that the survivors managed to build at Sierra Leone a fragile but functioning government and civil society. At present remove, it is almost impossible to uncover much about them in detail, but the evidence that exists about the discourse and the institutions and the habits of public life at Sierra Leone makes it impossible to doubt that government and civil society did take root there. And one of the best ways to sort of examine or to get a picture of what was going on is to look at interactions between the settlers and slave traders. The black settlers didn't arrive in Sierra Leone as the first point of British society on the river. There was a long history of British involvement already on the river, and there were Liverpool and Bristol slave traders who had established forts on islands in the Sierra Leone River and on parts of the shore. And when you look at interactions between slave traders and those British slave traders, I think we get a nice snapshot of how black governance and society developed. I made a mistake and didn't look at the clock when I started. Did someone look at it? Meredith, you didn't? Okay. Well, okay, I'm just going to stop when it looks like things are happening. Okay, 10 minutes after hour, thank you. Okay, I got to the big hands on the 11. That sounds right? All right, let's go. The colony's interaction with slave traders and slave factors in the Sierra Leone River was sometimes symbiotic, but it was often strained and violent. And looking at it offers some of the most detailed evidence concerning the path along which government and civil society developed in the province. In the colony's earliest days, even before all the settlers and supplies had been unloaded from the transports, it appears that the threat of enslavement catalyzed the articulation, if not the development, of civil cooperation and basic civic institutions. The information, for instance, that the master of one of the transports, the Belisarius, after he had emptied his ship of settlers, the remaining settlers got information that he had retained one of the refugees, one of the colonists on board. And they took that information to Captain Thompson, who fired a shot over the Belisarius as it was trying to leave the river. And that got his attention really quickly, and he decided that, that the master of the Belisarius decided that he would give up this settler. But this incident sort of, I think, cast light on the very beginnings of cooperative action that are going to develop into good, I think, good government in Sierra Leone, or at least government that we should pay attention to. One of the things that the settlers did after the departure of Thompson and the Nautilus, when they no longer had the ability to use Thompson as a police power, when they got in trouble with slave traders, they organized their own police force. So one of the main complaints about the black settlers at Sierra Leone is that the slave traders were constantly kidnapping and waylaying their people. I think it's important to realize and to pay close attention to that even when the settlers had no British institutions to call on, when the injustices done to them got to be too great, they struck out on their own. So in one case, they actually, for one captain who had taken some of the settlers and who had sailed away, they organized a sort of posse to go after him, and they captured him and they held him until he couldn't return his people, but he paid a fine in iron bars, which was a currency of the day. An incident from the summer of 1787 is also important to look at. In the summer of 1788, a group of about 4 of the migrants, very early in the morning, left the settlement at around 1 or 2 in the morning. They sailed up the river. And what we think happened, or at least what's likely happened, is they sailed to a British slave factory called Bant's Island. And when they got to the island, they broke into the stores. They ripped them off. And they headed back to Granville Town, which was the name of the settlement. When the white agent at Bant's Island realized that he had been broken into, he thought that it might have been the black settlers. So he got a posse of what he called his most active slaves, and they headed down to Granville Town. When they got to Granville Town, they went straight to the gentleman who was then the head of the settlement, and he made their case. The agent made his case. He argued that he had been broken into, and he suspected that some of the colonists were behind it. And what happened next is really important, because the head of the settlement didn't just give him free rein to go look around and investigate. What he said is, wait here, I need to call my council together. And so he got the man who had been designated as the Chief Justice of the settlement, and he brought him together, and he brought one more man together, and they discussed the situation. After they discussed it, they called the whole body of settlers together. And the agent from Banks Island was asked to give his evidence to the entire body of settlers. When the agent gave his evidence to the body of settlers, the settlers voted on whether to let him search the island, and they voted in the affirmative. But even after that vote, the Chief Justice wrote out a search warrant for the agent of Banks Island to make his search. He settled upon four migrants, 4 colonists as being responsible. But the whole investigation was not an investigation that was only carried out by the slave traders themselves. It was also carried out by the Executive Council, for lack of a better word, of the colony at Granville Town. And they all gave evidence. And when the evidence was given in the trial, in quotations, there were 7 slave traders and 5 colonists represented who took evidence. And so it looks, they didn't call it a jury, but it looks remarkably like a jury. Does 7 plus 5 equal 12? Did I get that right? Okay. It looks remarkably like a jury. But what's even, I think, more fascinating is that when the verdict was issued, and the verdict was banishment, they decided they would banish the settlers. And banishment in the summer of 1788 in Sierra Leone meant, what would you put them on if you're going to banish them? You've got to put them on a slave ship. And so banishment basically meant enslavement. But when the verdict came down, the 5 names of the 5 colonists were nowhere indicated. Were nowhere indicated, and it makes sense because it would probably be impossible to convince any 5 settlers at Granville Town that banishment was a proper punishment for anything. The ways that the black settlers behaved in Sierra Leone grieved the slave traders in the river to no end, and they complained constantly to the colonists about their behavior, but also back in London, and these complaints even moved the white philanthropists who had helped fund the expedition, to send letters to the colony asking the colonists to sort of tamp down on their anti-slavery activities and tamp down on their behavior on their bad behavior toward the slave traders. Here's Granville Sharp writing to the old settlers about the nature of their settlement and how he wishes that they would change. Sharp writes as follows: "Please be courteous and kind to all strangers that come to the settlement, even though you know them to be slave dealers or slave holders, provided that they do not offend your laws during their stay. What is done beyond your boundaries you cannot help or prevent." He's got to say this because these are people who, even though they have 20 square miles of land, are chasing slave traders all up and down the coast of Sierra Leone in order to get satisfaction when they want it. "Neither must you interfere with others in the least, except by kind and friendly warnings of God's impending vengeance against oppressors." So what Sharp wants them to do when someone steals men and women from the colony, just preach to them a little. You're going to hell if you don't stop this. But also, only when you have fair opportunity of mentioning the subject without giving personal offense. Referring no doubt to the settlers who had chased down the slave trader outside of their settlement, Sharp wrote as follows: "I hope you will in future be careful not to interfere in the least with any matter beyond the bounds of your territory, and be sure to maintain a friendly communication with all the neighboring factories, and more especially with those that are near, as the King of Rohanna's people," that's one of the native towns, Banks Island is a British factory, etc. and avoid all disputes with masters of ships about fees for anchorage and watering. One of the things that the settlers had done is they had started charging slave ships who were passing in front of their territory and who wanted to come ashore to find water, to find fresh water. They were also taking on sick sailors and nursing sick sailors back to health. Sharp thought that he would rather them not contend these rights or these disputes. He would rather them not to contend for them in case they might lose them and it might be refused. Those rights might be refused. I've given you in that a sort of hint at another aspect of black settler society in Sierra Leone that it's important to understand, and that's the economy that develops. When the settlers are first sent, they're sent out on the hopes that they're supposed to be self-sufficient. None of that works out, and so basically they become small traders, and they run up and down the river collecting fowls and selling them to ships that go by, often slave ships, and they become basically small traders up and down the river. And this is how they survive. The folks that they trade with aren't always happy about the way they do trade. These are people who insist on being treated fairly. They insist on their own personhood. And when they're cheated, they go after people, sometimes in the worst ways. I won't tell you. I'll tell you quickly a story about a man named, I think his name is Brutus, who's cheated by a surgeon on a slave ship, and he sees that surgeon on Bance Island, and he tells him straight off, he says, if I ever see you at Granville Town, we're going to tie you up and flog you because you owe us money. When the agent at Bance Island hears this, he doesn't think that any black man should be talking to a white man about civil punishments. And so he takes him and binds him and puts him in jail. But the economy develops. They have to develop a whole new economy than the one that they had envisioned on the way out. And there's a third point that is incredibly important, I think, to look at, and I'm going to rush through that so I can get to my conclusion. One of the most remarkable pieces of correspondence that comes from this time and place is a letter that's written to Granville Sharp by the leader of the settlement. And in a postscript to the letter, he writes that his name is Lucas. John Lucas is the leader of the settlement. John Lucas writes, Mrs. Lucas would like you to ask Reverend Fraser, who had fled all the way back to London, for a registry of the marriages. Because the women would like because they don't have a registry of the marriages. And this is hard to figure out. A lot of things could be happening here. It could be that maybe times are so hard that men are deciding if they're unable to support their families, perhaps they're trying to throw away responsibilities. And one of the things the women of the settlement want to do is to get proper documentation of the marriages so that they can push so they can push the men toward meeting their responsibilities. It could also be the other way around. But one of the things that I think is that is most telling about this document is that in all the lists, we have a certain number of lists of the people who depart for Sierra Leone. And on all the lists, there's no Mrs. John Lucas. When John Lucas goes out, there's no Mrs. John Lucas with him. But when Lucas writes this letter, after all of the terrible things that have transpired at Sierra Leone, after all the people who have died and who have deserted, when there's only a certain number left, that within all of this, people are marrying. But they're not just marrying, they're marrying in ways that they want documentation about the marriages. They're marrying in ways and they're behaving in ways that we would think British subjects, free British subjects, would behave. So now for why should we care about this settlement and how the society that these colonists build at Sierra Leone? There's only a few of them, only 100 and something of them, 200 something of them who survive. I think one of the reasons it's important is because it underlines some profound ambiguities about the relationship between slavery and freedom. These are people who many of are ex-slaves. They go out as ex-slaves. But they build a society in Sierra Leone that is implicated in all kinds of levels with slavery. Their economy is dependent in many ways upon slavery. Individuals in the group leave the settlement sometimes to become large slave dealers. They service slave ships in order to eat and to continue living. And so this underlines just the difficulty of sort of ideological purity in the 18th century, at least in terms of how slavery and freedom are concerned. But I think what's remarkable about how the settlers at Sierra Leone manage these ambiguities is that they come out of them with what I think should be described as a commitment to democracy, a commitment to anti-slavery, and a commitment to racial equality. They demand from the slave traders that they're working with that they be treated as equals. And I think that these black people carry and nurture these ideals are important. And it's important for contextualizing how we treat the founding generation in our country, black and white. I'm going to end by reading you something from Sean Willentz's new book on the rise of American democracy. Willentz thinks that we go astray in discussing democracy simply as a form of government or society, or as a set of social norms, a category or a thing with particular structures that can be codified and measured. Today, democracy in America means enfranchisement at a minimum of the entire adult citizenry. By that standard, the American democracy of the mid-19th century was hardly a democracy at all. Women of all classes and colors lacked political and civil rights. Most blacks were enslaved. Free black men found political rights they had once enjoyed either reduced or eliminated. The remnant of a ravaged Indian population in the eastern states had to be forced to move west without citizenship. Even the most expansive of the era's successful democratic political reforms encompassed considerably less than half of the total adult population, and at best a bare majority of the free adult citizenry. But to impose current categories of democracy on the past is to block any understanding of how our own, more elevated standards originated. It is to distort the lives of Americans who could barely have anticipated political and social changes that we take for granted. It is to substitute our experiences and prejudices for theirs. I don't have any trouble with Sean Willentz. He's really smart. But I think I am disturbed by the ways we decide whether we're going to give people passes or not in evaluating what was possible for them. And so what I take from Willentz's argument when he says that these are people, we can't ask too much of the Founding Fathers because no one was thinking about democracy on the order that we think it. No one was thinking about racial equality on the order that we think it now. I think what it does is it too narrows the founders' world, and it means that people like the blacks who end up in Sierra Leone, who definitely have a conception of a broader sense of democracy, and who are contemporaries of the founding generation, who definitely have an understanding that it's possible and perhaps necessary to build a society in a place where everyone seems to be practicing slavery, but it could be possible for us to build that society and not practice it. When we say we're not going to hold the founders to those standards, I think what we're saying is that these people who did hold those ideals, they don't count. They're not part of the context. Jefferson wasn't in discussion with them. We can't require of him to know that black people understood or had a more expansive understanding of freedom. And I think we can hold him to the standard, to a higher standard, or hold them to a higher standard. And this example of these black migrants who fight to be human in the late 18th century, I hope, provides evidence for that. Look at that. I think I'm done.
Okay, Alex, why don't I get us started? One of the things that struck me about your account is that you made the case that the settlers who survived in Sierra Leone were very interested in instituting a democratic culture and the pursuit of equality and institutional rights and structures of proper dealing with others that reflect the sort of British and Anglo tradition out of which they came. But you documented that in terms of their relations internally, that is to say with one another, and vis-a-vis especially the slavers, especially the British slavers. And the question that automatically arose for me is, what about the indigenous population? What was their attitude? What was their relationship? How do you see that reflecting this democratic dimension?
They weren't always very democratic with the natives, with the peoples whose land that they bought. But that also may be too broad of a characterization. They had different foreign relations. And so there would be someone like King Jimmy, who in a couple of years is going to burn them to the ground, burn them completely out and scatter them across the river, who they don't get along with, who they're interested in doing harm to at any stage that they can, who basically they're acting in the ways that will develop in the early 19th century when the place becomes a crown colony. They're being very British colonial toward King Jimmy, or they want to be. If they were stronger, they would crush him. But that said, they behave very differently toward King Jimmy's the man known as King Jimmy's paramount chief, who's very interested in relations with Great Britain. He sends a son to London to be educated. He protects the settlement from people like Jimmy and other folks. But I think the relationship with Jimmy's paramount chief is the exception rather than the rule. They feel very threatened by most of the Africans who are around them, at least as a colony. Individual relations sometimes vary, and there are instances later on of people seeking medicine and sort of judgment from Africans in the area, but that's more at an individual level.
Yeah, Alex, let me follow up a little bit on this question and turn it around and ask, how did the British slave traders view these settlers, and how did they distinguish them as a category of human being from the Africans that they were enslaving?
The British slave traders were they were threatened. They were extraordinarily threatened by the arrival of these folks. If there were 5 or 6 ships in the river, British ships in the river, there might be 200 British slave traders in the area. That's if there's that many ships in the river, and what the arrival of these folks do is all of a sudden change the locus of what could be called British power in the area. All of a sudden, they have the numbers, even at reduced strength. And so, though it's clear in the way that they have a sort of different way of talking about the black settlers, instead of what throws the slave traders off about the colonists is that they act like they're equals. And so there's no language about don't these people are less than human. That doesn't show up in the letters of British slave traders. What shows up is these people think they're better than us. There's absolutely no deference, and all the things that we should be expecting from them, they don't have, or they're not demonstrating, they're not showing. But even relations between those two groups are complicated. They're many times at odds, the slave traders and the free settlers, but sometimes they ally. They ally against King Jimmy, for example. Jimmy is not only causing the free settlers' problems, he's causing the slave traders' problems. And so when a British ship shows up, when a frigate shows up, they both make common cause against Jimmy. But the upshot of that common cause is that the colonists end up feeling the brunt, because when the British frigate leaves and some damage has been done to Jimmy's town, it's hard to know what happened, but this is what I think happened. I think the slave traders then they see an opportunity to sick Jimmy on the free settlers. And so Jimmy burns them out. The slave traders show up and say, oh, let us take you some other places. And they disperse them all along the river. A good number of them above the settlement at Vance Island, where there'll be less of a problem.
Do you suppose that the black British settlement in Sierra Leone served as a model or a precursor to the idea of black American settlement in Liberia?
It is a precursor in a lot of ways, and so it's a model. It becomes a model for Liberia. There's communication back and forth between the philanthropists. There's communication between the United States and Britain among people who are interested in colonization as an idea. As Sierra Leone develops, in 1791-92, when a whole bunch of people come over, and about 1,200 folks arrive from Nova Scotia, it becomes a precursor to what's going to happen in Liberia in terms of native relations with colonists. So yes, that's what I should have just said.
Hi. Could you speak a little bit to American awareness of the settlements? Were the Founding Fathers at all aware of these settlements? And how do you think they would have been perceived given the revolutionary interest in ideologies of democracy and freedom?
Yeah, you have pointed me to some work that I need to do, but watch me try to answer anyway. People who were sort of contemporaries in Jamaica and in the British West Indies after the American War were aware of them. And these are folks who read many of the same papers. And so I'd imagine if I looked hard enough that I would find evidence of that they were aware. There was a second part to your question, though.
How do you think they would have been perceived? Or
I think they would have been, they wouldn't have been happy about this first group, about how things went with this first group. These slaves these former slaves who go over in 86, 87 are too independent. They're not under any white supervision, and this leaves the possibilities too wide open for all kinds of mischief, which is what they do. I think they would fall more in terms of Americans' interest in colonization, how Sierra Leone develops when there's a company, the Sierra Leone Company is chartered, and a former British naval lieutenant is put in charge of the settlement in 1791-92. I think Americans interested in colonization, not black Americans interested in colonization, but slaveholders who are interested in colonization would think that the model that evolves in 1791-92, in which these people are supervised or closely supervised, can only trade with the company, don't have a militia or can't develop an army, I imagine they would like that idea better.
Alex, you...
I see you, I'm sorry.
So far away. You point at the end of your talk to the limitations of arguments like that made by Sean Wilentz. That is to say, an argument that goes, by 18th century standards, the founding fathers and others like them were actually quite revolutionary in their capacity to imagine freedom and equality for what they took to be all humans, and that we can't fault them for the limitations of their vision because that would be imposing our standards upon the past, right? And that it would be unrealistic and, in fact, in some sense unfair to expect Thomas Jefferson to prefigure our expansive notions of what would constitute a truly democratic society. So my question is, given that, given your persuasive critique of that conventional argument, which you make by pointing to contemporaneous societies that are in fact able to imagine a much more expansive view of democracy and of human freedom and equality, my question is, are there persistent limitations to the conception of freedom and equality and humanity that are articulated by our founding fathers that we need to now pay attention to, given that contemporaneous persons were able to imagine a much more radical, inclusive kind of democracy?
You're saying, are there other limitations that we need to
I'm
examine?
saying, are there limitations that persist today? Are we suffering today from the fact that our own ideas about human freedom and equality build on those articulated by, say, Jefferson and not by the folks at Sierra Leone?
Not by Thomas Peters. Wow. I think those guys, I want to start by saying those guys were brilliant. Like when I want, right.
I get that.
I want to start by saying that they're brilliant, or were brilliant. I think we suffer because we don't, and I don't know if this is an answer, but I think we suffer in one instance because we don't understand that there are ways in which our vision, there are some instances in which our vision is more narrow than even theirs were. I think we suffer from that. I think we suffer from not fully understanding, and this I may be speaking too strongly, but by fully understanding the damage that has been done or that is done. We celebrate the Constitution, and we should. I think it's almost Constitution Day, or it was a few days ago. But there are some ways in which it's a profoundly damaging, there's some profoundly damaging ideas and institutions that are erected in that document that we don't pay attention to and that we don't take seriously because we're in the process of celebrating it.
We have another question up there.
Thank you. When the rain stopped, how many were left? And what percentage were children? What percentage male and female? And thirdly and fourthly, most important, what role, if any, did schools or education? How many were literate, for instance? And what about the church?
Okay, here we go.
Are these all Anglicans?
No, but I can answer these. And the answer to the first question is we don't know after the rain stopped. But we know a lot of folks died. Our last list is when Thomas Thompson leaves the river 4 or 5 months afterwards. There aren't many children. I can answer broadly by saying not many children go and not many women go. And that's consistent across all lists. So after the deaths, probably the number of men may even rise. in proportion to the entire settlement. They are extraordinarily interested in education. One of the things that the Reverend Fraser writes back, even on the ships on the way to Sierra Leone, they're organizing schools for the children on the ships. I don't know if they're able to continue that once they land, but I know it's an aspiration. It's very important to them. In terms of church, I'm sorry?
What proportion are literate?
Few, very few. So people, that's an answer, isn't it? Very few. Most of them aren't. There may be, the evidence that we have suggests that 4 or 5 of them who survive out of that 130 folks who form the core of the settlement are literate. They use that literacy to get appointments with the Africans as sort of translators and ambassadors and things like that. Now, in terms of church or religion, there's absolutely no evidence at least in that I know of in London itself that these are religious people in any way, shape, or form. The folks who show up in 91, 92 do have more of a religious community. There is a letter, though, that suggests, there are 2 letters that suggest a certain amount of religiosity. One is when there's some intra-community problems early on, and a mob of people come and chase one of the old leaders out and threaten to kill him if he doesn't run. They do it in God's name. They tell him that God is basically sanctioning this. So that suggests, well, I don't know what that suggests. But there's another letter that comes out later on when they're writing Granville Sharp before they're burned out, and they're asking for supplies. And the 3 things that they're interested in building are a prison, I think a meeting house, and a church. And they ask for a bell that they can ring to call the people to prayers. So.
Well, then we can continue this after.
Thank y'all.